The AFT. Welcome to our second season of Brian Lehrer Live. We will be here every Wednesday night at 7:30 this fall. And what a week for politics, local, national, and global. We have the unorthodox ending to the Democratic mayoral primary with Anthony Weiner deciding not to count all the votes. We'll talk about that later. And we have the historic UN summit with 175 world leaders in town to help devise a plan to end global poverty. We'll talk tonight with guests from India and the Netherlands who are attending the summit. And we have the John Roberts confirmation hearings, plus President Bush speaking at the UN and taking responsibility for the federal government's failures after Hurricane Katrina. And we'll talk first about that with Richard Wolffe, senior White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Richard, welcome to Brian Lehrer Live.
Great to be with you.
The president actually made an appearance yesterday in which he said he took responsibility for the government's failures after Katrina. What specifically did he take responsibility for?
Well, it wasn't quite clear. He left himself a lot of wiggle room. He said he was taking responsibility to the extent that there were mistakes. So this is a sort of limited acceptance of responsibility. Having said that, for this president, it's still very significant. He is notoriously reluctant to admit mistakes, and it says an awful lot about how they're approaching this phase of the post-hurricane period, if you will. That's to say, they want to turn the page. They want to move beyond what we all have been doing in the media, looking at what went wrong and who's to blame, and start looking forward. This is a classic piece of turning the page in Washington.
And yet the president keeps bringing attention to this issue, which is seen by so many Americans as a failure of his administration. He talked about it yesterday. He's going to do the live primetime address tomorrow night.
Right.
Why does he keep drawing attention right onto himself rather than delegating this to some of his aides?
Well, of course, he did fire the head of FEMA, and that itself was very extraordinary. Again, this is a president who is not just reluctant to admit mistakes, but reluctant to fire anyone. I mean, you can count on one hand the number of people who've genuinely been fired, as far as we know. They've tried to start pushing this on other people. That was their first position. But in many ways, they know that the president has to embody the national mood. And the national mood is not just about rebuilding, it's not just about the horror, it's about somebody saying the buck stops here, and really there's nobody else who can fulfill that role.
So what do you expect to hear in this address tomorrow night?
Well, tomorrow night is going to be very much about looking forward. I expect he'll recap some of the sort of elements of contrition that we heard the other day. Some of the White House aides we regularly speak to say that, in fact, he was supposed to make that sort of apology tomorrow. In his remarks, he sort of got ahead of himself there yesterday. But he'll talk very much about the reconstruction, about his plans for a sort of Lower Manhattan Development Corporation type of thing for Louisiana especially, but for the whole Gulf region. And he'll talk about, again, something that has been very uppermost in his mind, this balancing the state and the federal roles, not just in the hurricane response, but moving forward.
You know, I was very interested in the context in which he appeared before the public to take responsibility for the failures after Hurricane Katrina. He did it in a joint appearance with the president of Iraq,
right,
Jalal Talabani. Now, Iraq, of all things, is the policy on which many Americans might have expected the president to take responsibility for failures. He has never done it with respect to the war. And so it was kind of strange, in a way, that he took responsibility for this failure while standing next to the president of Iraq, when that war is now considered a failure to most American people, according to the polls.
Yeah, there are interesting parallels here between what we've seen with his response to Katrina and the management of the war in Iraq and the occupation in Iraq. You know, if for a start, these two things, I think, are really going to dominate what's left of his term. Reconstruction, the whole aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and, of course, Iraq and the project over there. But there's also parallels in terms of how he's got himself into this position. There have long been question marks in Iraq about the kind of information he's getting, about his management style, about whether he has delegated to the right people, and his responsiveness to things that everybody can see on TV, but he doesn't seem to acknowledge. Mistakes are part of that, but it's only one small part of that. Another thing is, does he really see how bad things are? And that was certainly a factor in people's attitudes towards Katrina.
Interesting. Also today, the President spoke at the United Nations. Now, the UN is having a huge summit meeting. To most New Yorkers, this is a traffic on the East Side story, but to most other people in the world, this is a huge epical event. 175 world leaders to talk A, about UN reform, and B, about the Millennium Development Goals, which are an attempt to cut poverty in half, the worst poverty in half, by the year 2015. The U.S. has been a main obstacle to some of the particulars of that policy. What did the President say at the UN today?
Well, the President made a very simple and straightforward statement which had a big impact. Over the last several weeks, there have been question marks about whether the Bush administration is at all committed to these goals that it's previously supported, and especially because they relate to increasing the amount of aid that goes to addressing world poverty. The President said today that he was actually committed to those goals, and that simple statement ends weeks of wrangling that have been going on behind the scenes. These have been very emotional and very deeply fought out between the different sides. But the President effectively laid that to rest today. He said that he stands by those goals, and they are important goals. They're things that you can measure these world leaders by and go back to years on and say, did you deliver?
Now, what does standing by those goals mean? One number that's been kicked around is 0.7% of GDP for development aid. That's 0.7% of the entire gross national economy of wealthier nations, of developed nations, for developing nations. The U.S. has been very much against that. We now give less than 0.2%. So that would be a huge increase in our financial aid. So when the President says he's committed to the Millennium Development Goals, does it mean that?
Well, they are goals, remember. They're not actual cash. And these are large sums of money. We talk about 0.2 and 0.7, but actually in real terms, that's a lot of money, given the size of the American economy. But they are goals, they're aims, and you know, the President has a decent record in terms of increasing foreign aid. He certainly has a record that more than stands up to President Clinton's record. But they are still overall low in terms of the proportion of the American economy. The American administration here has got this ability to say, well, it's a long-term goal. They also say that over the time period we're talking about, we can't plan our budgets and commit future administrations to these increases. So there are legal obstacles in this way that other governments don't face. But it is
so
just...
what does committed mean?
Well, in development terms, a commitment is a statement of intent, but it's not really a legally binding document in any way.
And so what about this entire UN Millennium Development Goal document that's going to come out of this summit? Is it binding in any way? I heard someone on television today saying the UN gets together time after time on issue after issue and sets goals that sound very laudable, like cutting extreme poverty in half, but then they always set timetables that are very far in the future, like 2015 in this case. So is there anything concrete? Are we going to be able to measure any progress from this in terms of the poorest of the poor next year or the year after that?
Well, you know, there are groups like the G8 that are also committed to these things that meet regularly, and they can be measured. But more than just the poverty side of this, what these people have been, what these leaders have been negotiating is in many cases a rewriting of the UN Charter. That is a legal document that these countries are going to have to ratify themselves. It deals with really rewriting a lot of the functions of the UN, especially controversial things like the Human Rights Commission. They create a new peace-building operation for post-conflict situations where we all know there has been gaping holes in the world community. So, and there's also, they've kicked this down the road a bit, but there's also obviously very intense debate going on about the Security Council. All of these things do actually come down to legal documents. They come down to treaties and charters. So they can be held to that alone, and that will get over, I think, if the reforms are successful, some of the frustrations that people have repeatedly said that the UN doesn't achieve things.
One of the things that they apparently failed to achieve that President Bush and Kofi Annan agreed on, as I understand it, was a definition of terrorism.
Right.
Everybody's against terrorism, but nobody wants to tell you exactly what it is. And the U.S. and the UN wanted to define terrorism essentially as violence against civilians. Mm-hmm. And that was too specific for a lot of countries, wasn't it?
Yeah, you know, what happened here is that it wasn't just on terrorism they failed. There was also a huge failure on proliferation, especially nuclear proliferation. You know, these things ought to be fairly clear to everybody. Of course, one man's terrorist is famously another man's freedom fighter, and when you get to countries like Pakistan, there are very vigorous disputes with the rest of the world about things like their activities in Kashmir, where they don't consider their fighters there as terrorists. They think they are genuinely freedom fighters. So, you know, what happens in a case like this, especially with the negotiations as they were managed in many ways by the United States and its ambassador now, John Bolton, you had an opening up of these documents that had been worked over for many, many weeks and months, and that allowed countries to pursue their own agenda. There were spoiler countries in there who were fighting for their own personal interests, and that's where you need leadership in a very complex negotiation. You need the big countries to stand together, and in fact that really didn't happen this time. The failure was very much involved the United States as well as these other countries.
Did President Bush, in a way, overrule John Bolton today when he said he was committed to the Millennium Development Goals? Because certainly to hear the rhetoric coming out of John Bolton's mouth in the last few days and few weeks, it didn't sound like he was committed.
I think there has been let's say, a radical revisiting of John Bolton's negotiating position and style that's involved many people in the administration, inside the State Department, also in the White House. And certainly the President's position today on those poverty goals is very, very different. It looks to me that that John Bolton has had his wings clipped a little bit here in what was really his first big effort at the UN.
And on the terrorism question, who is it exactly who doesn't want to define terrorism as purposeful violence against civilians?
Well, some of these spoiler countries are familiar to people about terrorism. They involve things like Libya, Cuba, Algeria, Pakistan. Sometimes they're not spoiling just about terrorism. They have their own agendas about all sorts of things, from trade right the way through to the Human Rights Commission. But the terrorism dispute does cut across many, many different countries. And as I say, you just look at Pakistan and Kashmir and their relationship with India there. The Indians see the Kashmiri dispute very much in terms of terrorism. The Pakistanis don't, and that's true of the highest levels and the lowest levels of that government.
And some of the Arab nations, because they don't want the murder of Israeli civilians to be counted as terrorism?
Of course, Israel too. And to be honest, when you look at the definition about terrorism, there are many European countries that have, at least in some of their elected officials, have spoken about the Israeli army acting in a terrorist-like fashion. So Israel and the Palestinian conflict as well poses many, many problems in terms of that definition. It should be easy, but politics, I'm afraid, intervenes.
You wrote an article on the Newsweek website today in which you placed both the Hurricane Katrina issue with respect to President Bush and his speech at the UN today, as you framed it as a kind of set of bookends. Right. Explain that.
Well, you know, people have talked about Hurricane Katrina, especially coming so close to the anniversary of 9/11, as a sort of bookend to what we saw in 2001. And a bookend in the sense that the President's leadership seems to have come full cycle. After 9/11, there was a rallying around the President and his response to the attacks on that day. That hasn't happened now, and it's a sign of how people have come to question his leadership. And the polls show that his decline in being perceived as a strong leader is really quite significant. What we saw at the UN is another form of bookend here. Not so much the 9/11, but what followed after that, which was the run-up to the war in Iraq. 3 years ago, the President went to the UN, to the General Assembly, to many of those same leaders, and said that either they followed him in confronting Saddam Hussein, or the UN risked becoming irrelevant. What he said today was 180 degrees different. Again, a full cycle in terms of his attitude towards the UN.
Because he committed himself to something that the UN had generated, the Millennium Development Goals.
Right, he committed himself to those goals. He asked for their support on Iraq in very clear terms, but just as importantly, he welcomed their support on Katrina. And if you remember, just a few days ago, he was actually telling ABC that thank you very much, but America could handle it for itself and take care of it, he said, for itself.
When you said he welcomed the UN support on Katrina, what does that mean? Was the President of the United States asking other countries for money?
Well, those contributions and those offers have been made. What happened after Katrina was many of those countries felt that because of the President's comments and because of FEMA tying things up in red tape, that their offers were rejected, whether it was money or plane loads of supplies, of tents and other things, of communications equipment, for instance. They thought that the United States didn't want the help. When the President came out to say, it was very significant in that regard, because he said, thank you for your support, it means a lot to us, and it shows that we can, like the tsunami, we can do more together than we can separately.
Richard Wolffe, Newsweek, Chief White House Correspondent, thank you very much for coming in. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And coming up next, the unorthodox ending to the Democratic mayoral primary. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
It's heartbreaking to watch what our fellow citizens in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are going through. And it invokes within all of us a desire to help. And all of us can help.
You know, we know Americans are generous, compassionate people, and that's why we come to you again, not as presidents, but as private citizens.
The best way to help now is to make a cash donation. And every contribution, large or small, will impact a life. So please visit usafreedomcorps.gov for more information on how you can give.
Our fellow Americans along the Gulf Coast will need the help of this country for a long, long time. It'll be a difficult road, but when tragedy strikes, Americans respond.
And America is better for it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matthew Goldstein. New Yorkers are choosing CUNY colleges in record numbers. CUNY has a world-class faculty and state-of-the-art facilities. Come visit our campuses located in every borough. Talk with career advisors and financial aid experts. Contact us at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES. CUNY will invest in your future. Invest in CUNY now.
This is Brian Lehrer Live, our season premiere for fall 2005. We will be here every Wednesday night at 7:30. Now, no one does election returns in one day anymore. That's so old-fashioned. So yesterday's Democratic mayoral primary finally ended today. And it ended in dramatic fashion when Congressman Anthony Weiner, with shades of John Kerry in Ohio perhaps, decided not to count every vote before conceding the nomination to Freddie Ferrer. Why did he do it? With us briefly now by telephone is New York Democratic Congressman Eliot Engel, who represents the Bronx, Westchester, and Rockland. He's also a Weiner supporter. Thank you very much for coming on, Congressman. Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
Now, Congressman Weiner was within about 200 votes of a runoff election, and there were more than 10,000 absentee ballots to be counted, most likely. Why didn't he just wait at least for that?
Well, I think he made a decision that because Freddie Ferrer had come so close to the 40%, that if Anthony stayed into the race, I think he thought it would be a divisive fight, and he wanted to avoid any kind of divisiveness. So he made that decision to let the 40%, almost 40% stand. The problem, Brian, is, and it's really a big flaw of the system, it takes a couple of weeks to really open up all the absentee ballots and count them, and you only have a couple of weeks for the runoff.
Right.
So
although this wasn't like Bush versus Gore. This wasn't about a recount. He didn't wait for the first count.
Well, that's true, and there are people that wish he had stayed in. There are many people who believe that he would have won a runoff. I happen to be one of them. But I think that Anthony felt so strongly that this would help Democratic Party unity, that he just made a decision to do that.
Congressman Engel, I understand the Bloomberg campaign is already tearing into Congressman Weiner's decision and saying, oh, here's a guy who ran as a reformer for the Democratic Party, and at the first request, he's caving to the party bosses. What do you say to that?
Well, I know Anthony, and he didn't cave to any boss. He did what he thought was right, and, you know, one could criticize his decision, but he didn't do it under any pressure at all. I know that for sure. He did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. And he did it. Now, I think history will tell, or time will tell, whether it was the right thing to do. I think that a case could have been made either way, but Anthony felt that he did not want to be the one who divided the party. I think that he felt very strange that the total for Freddie Ferrer was, I think it was 39.949 or something like that. And I think if it had been 37 or 38, I think Anthony surely would have stayed in the race. But I think that he felt it was within a couple of hundred votes. And once you get to
40%, then you avoid the runoff. Congressman Weiner said he and Freddie Ferrer represented different wings of the Democratic Party, especially on taxes. So why did the congressman duck the opportunity to have that public debate? Maybe he didn't think it was that important.
Well, again, I really can't answer that. It was, other than to say it was a very personal decision that he made, and he just felt that the Democrats are going to have a very difficult time winning in November, no matter who the nominee is. And I think that Anthony didn't feel that he wanted to play a role in what could be looked at as a divisive runoff and dividing the party.
Can he credibly support Fernando Ferrer now with the way he ran against him?
Well, you know, politics are very funny, Brian, and a lot of people say a lot of things and do a lot of things, and then wind up supporting the old adage. Of course, politics makes strange bedfellows. I don't think that Anthony Weiner and Freddie Ferrer are fundamentally different.
Oh, did we lose Congressman Engel? I guess we...
Anthony Weiner. I thought Anthony was by far and away the best candidate, a young friend.
All right, you know what? I think we're gonna move on, and I think we've gotten most of the answers that we needed anyway from Congressman Eliot Engel representing, or at least supporting, Congressman Anthony Weiner. And with us now to discuss Anthony Weiner's unorthodox decision and what comes next, Democratic political consultant Hank Sheinkopf. His clients this primary season included winner Betsy Gottbaum, who will be back as public advocate, and two second-place finishers in crowded fields, Eva Moskowitz in the Manhattan Borough President's race, and John Sampson, who ran for Brooklyn DA. Also with us, Daily News columnist Errol Lewis. Hi, Errol. Hank Sheinkopf, welcome to Brian Lehrer Live. Errol, why did Anthony Weiner not wait for all the votes to be counted?
Well, to tease out my column that's going to run in the Daily News tomorrow, get my little plug in.
And to promote it.
My opinion is that he made a decision that he didn't want to do what he would have had to do in order to get going. I mean, Eliot Engel, who you interviewed, was one of, as far as I know, only two officials, the other being Assemblyman Jeff Dinowitz of the Bronx, who had endorsed Weiner. He didn't come into this with a lot of support. He did remarkably well under those circumstances, but the history of past runoffs suggests that this is the point where people get a little crazy, where people go and start making deals with party bosses, and they make deals that later come back to haunt them. So in 1977, when Koch was in a runoff against Mario Cuomo, he went and made a famous deal with Meade Esposito, who was then the boss of Brooklyn. He made another deal with Stanley Friedman, who was the boss of the Bronx. It ended up in scandal, indictments, imprisonment. It helped end Koch's political career when the corruption did sort of rise up and get reported in the press. Likewise, 4 years ago in 2001, in the runoff between Ferrer and Mark Green, that was the point at which what had been a relatively civil contest up to that point turned really ugly and really divisive. And these racially inflammatory flyers start popping up in Brooklyn, and phone calls go out to people saying that, you know, Ferrer is going to make Al Sharpton the police commissioner and all of this kind of craziness. And those divisions have not yet entirely healed. So I think Weiner sized up his options, and he decided he wasn't going to go and prostrate himself in front of the likes of Clarence Norman, the Brooklyn boss who's currently on trial for corruption, or Tom Manton out in Queens.
And maybe he decided that his future is better served by losing well than by losing ugly, which probably would have happened, or that is, he would have been.
I think he could have won ugly. Actually.
You do. You think he could have beat Ferrer in a runoff?
Absolutely. When you look at what happened, well, provided he got a certain amount of momentum and a certain amount of money, just the basics in order to participate, which the campaign finance system helps make possible. You get some percentage of all the money you've already raised automatically for a runoff. You also get a debate, a televised debate. So, and that's a pretty good way to get one's message out. Yeah. But, Ferrer finished first in the first round 4 years ago, and then he went on to lose the runoff. And the way that Mark Green won was he won ugly. I mean, it's been known to happen.
Hank, I don't know if he won ugly. I was the consultant to that campaign.
If you were a consultant to this campaign, would you have advised Anthony Weiner to do what he did?
I would have seen the specter of Ruth Messinger and Al Sharpton in 1977, a disaster for Democrats, and I would have said, you know what, if you'd won, if the distance were 5 points, 3 points, no, that's one thing. 200 votes potentially. And by the time they count the absentees,
a 200 vote or 200 votes shy out of 450,000 votes cast. That's how close Ferrer came to 40%.
This is more a story of the failure of the runoff system, which we don't really need, in my view, and ought to be gone with. I mean, we ought to just get rid of it so we don't have this madness.
Really? If you have 9 candidates in a race like we had in Manhattan Borough President, they don't have a runoff system. Only the citywide offices have a runoff system. But if we had 9 candidates running for the Democratic mayoral primary and somebody won with 18%, that would be okay with you?
There's a way to get rid of that person in the fall. Simple. We'll go back to the original question. Anthony Weiner did the smart thing, the right thing, and the common sense thing. From a political perspective, he gained an awful lot. They're not going to be able to attack him and bash him around. He gets to play again in 4 years.
Well, what about the bashing that the Bloomberg campaign has already started to do that says, look, you ran as the anti-democratic establishment reformer, and you caved as soon as the party bosses asked you for a favor.
Brian, that's not an attack on Weiner. That's an attack on the party bosses. That's a way to deal with Democrats.
It's not an attack on both?
Nah, Weiner's out of the picture. That's a way of saying, look, Democratic Party bosses are Democratic Party bosses. And by the way, Mike Bloomberg is independent. That's a different argument. Different argument. That's why they did it. Now, let me just finish the other point.
Yeah.
The city is majority-minority. The Hispanic vote will become more significant over time, not less. Anthony Weiner wants a future. Don't go after the favorite son.
Don't go after
the favorite son of that community. Remember, until 2001, there hadn't been a Hispanic standard bearer for mayor from 1973 until 2001, and I was at the shootout in '73. This I understand. There's something else going on here. This is the last. My hunch is that this is the last campaign where you'll see large amounts of ethnic tribalism and racial tribalism, if they exist at all, which has been a staple of New York City politics. We're becoming a much more class-based city. This is a majority-minority city. The economic strides of the Clinton years, I mean, look, per capita income in Southeast Queens is higher than the rest of the county, which people fail to understand. This is a very different and changed city. This is the last gasp of the white working class, the outer boroughs, the world I came from. It's going to be all different in 4 years, and Weiner will have a shot then. If he gets out, if he had stayed in, he'd be dead.
Do you agree with that analysis? And do you think that Anthony Weiner did not want to be perceived as the great white hope against the Latino frontrunner, even if he wasn't portraying himself that way?
I'd say I know for a fact that Weiner is very sensitive to that charge, and he knows that there would be forces that would be pushing him in exactly that direction. You go out and you talk to voters in places like Woodside or Sunnyside, out College Point. They're very conservative. Sometimes they elect Republicans. More often they elect conservative Democrats. And they would have been looking to Weiner, and it was almost coded in a way. When you hear him say things like, we've got to change the direction of this party, we've got to talk to the middle class, as opposed to the poor, frankly. That's a sort of coded appeal to that group, and it can turn ugly very, very fast. And I think Weiner's very sensitive to that. If this is ancient history now, but the first time he ran for city council, there were some flyers that came out towards the end of that race that were accusing one of his opponents of being in the sort of David Dinkins, Jesse Jackson wing of the Democratic Party. And it was considered really kind of inflammatory. It was a fairly progressive district in a lot of ways. It included Park Slope, where he grew up. And there's some people who really reacted negatively to that. I think Weiner, because he has represented very conservative portions of the Democratic polity, he's very aware of what it takes for him to do something like support gay marriage, which he does, or to make common cause with candidates of color, which he often does. I'll defer to Hank Sheinkopf on this. If he's thinking ahead and looking at the city as it's going to be, and those of us who do follow this stuff realize that it's going to be a very different city going forward, maybe he thinks that this is where his future best interests lie.
Now, we will be devoting much of our series this fall to analyzing how the mayoral race is being portrayed on TV, in news stories and TV commercials. And sure enough, one of the main reasons that Anthony Weiner came on as strongly as he did in the last week was some very effective TV ads. Let's look at one.
PS 39. I went to public schools my whole life. I'm Congressman Anthony Weiner, and I'm running for mayor. Public schools are the only chance most kids get, and I want to fix them. My ideas? Pay teachers more so we keep them here, and get those who don't perform out. Give principals real authority to discipline, and get back to basics. With 1 million kids in the public schools and a mom who was a teacher for 31 years, nothing's more important to me.
Anthony Weiner, finally a fighter for hardworking New York.
Hank Sheinkopf, how important were ads like that to Anthony Weiner's late surge?
Well, you got to look at where he surged. The fact you say late surge, in fact, he surged when television went up. Those are the best ads of the cycle, except for the ones, of course, the Betsy got bumped. No, seriously. Those are the best ads of the cycle in the mayoral contest for different reasons. They are pointed, they are to the camera, they are issue directed, they're not fluff and romance about who knows what, and they go right to people's hearts. This is not a business of brains, this is a business of hearts. They're very, very good.
Not fluff and romance. Let's go to another ad. You'll tell if you think this is fluff and romance. This is a Ferrer ad, and I'm curious if our guests think we'll see the same kind of commercial in the general election.
The apartment I grew up in here in the South Bronx wasn't much, but it was home. My mother and grandmother worked hard to pay the rent, and there was always enough left to live on. But today, even the middle class is struggling.
Fernando Ferrer, endorsed by the New York Times for leading a resurgence in the Bronx, where he helped build affordable houses and apartments. Now, with families in danger of being priced out of the city, his housing plan has won praise from advocates. Fernando Ferrer, for all of us for a change.
So, Errol Lewis, he also starts out where he grew up.
Yeah, absolutely. He tries to tell a story that has a beginning, middle, and an end, and to stir up some urgency. So the beginning is he's a regular guy like everybody else. He had a great upbringing. He was fortunate. Now the middle class is in danger, and he's stepping forward to try and rescue that middle class. What I think is interesting is he says middle class. When Anthony Weiner says middle class, they're talking about two very different kind of groups. I mean, when Weiner talks about the middle class, he's talking about middle-class homeowners in his Queens district and elsewhere, districts like it. When Ferrer's talking about the middle class, I think he's more talking about people who are trying to make it solidly and into the middle class. I mean, I don't know that he's necessarily talking about that same strata. So he's setting that up for us as the story that he wants to tell.
Hank, was that one of those fuzzy-lensed ads you were talking about?
More fuzzy than Weiner, certainly. Weiner was much more direct. And people voted. I think the turnouts were light because people weren't excited by this campaign. This was not your average New York, let's get a carnival act and bash everybody around and we'll have all kinds of divisiveness. The UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, 1199, major players stood this one out. I mean, they weren't involved. And it was, and the reason why it wasn't as exciting is those kinds of ads. Not sharp enough, not to the point, kind of put you to sleep. And he had to do this because he had already made sufficient errors.
He had already made sufficient errors, like on the Diallo case, saying he was over-indicted, that kind of thing.
The Diallo thing was
so how does that counteract that?
Soften it up. Don't be. Freddie's deal was not to be controversial, and as I used to be told as a kid, don't make trouble. You didn't make any trouble. You just had to get to the finish line.
And he got to the finish line with close enough to 40% to get Anthony Weiner to drop out at any rate. Do you think that's the kind of ad we're going to see as he launches his general election campaign against Mike Bloomberg?
I think you're going to see some of that, but always remember the following. Said as someone who's with 35 years' experience doing this, who's made presidential media. Always remember the following: no incumbent is defeated without a negative or comparative argument of substance. And we're going to, in order for him to get into the game, he's going to have to take on the mayor pretty fast.
We saw a bit of that even just last night. The speech that he gave was, the best he's given in this cycle for sure. Probably one of the best in his life.
For people who weren't up late enough to see it, that was a real fire in the belly speech when he has been very quiet, restrained, playing the front runner, almost a Rose Garden strategy. Last night he was bang, bang, bang.
Absolutely, and the theme he kept repeating was, "There's a new city rising. If you're one of these people who's stressed out, you have 2 jobs. You can't pay your bills, you can't pay your rent. There's a new city rising, and your time is now." I mean, it was just a call to action it was almost like a sort of a social revolution he's calling for.
Let's play another ad and talk about why it was not more effective. This one is for Gifford Miller, who came in 4th.
You know how kids learn best? When they get attention, when they're challenged. It's tough when you got too many kids in a classroom.
As head of the city council, Gifford Miller just restored over $1 billion for new school construction.
My plan is for 17 kids per class, no more. We can pay for that if we cancel a tax cut for people making more than $500,000 a year. 17 kids per class. Mike Bloomberg won't make that happen. I will. So what are we waiting for?
Now, Hank, I actually thought that was a pretty good ad. He couldn't tell us how he grew up because he grew up relatively rich, but he got right into the smaller class size issue, which hits home with a lot of people, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it doesn't hit home to see a future mayor moving chairs around. Sorry. Mayors don't do that.
The physical, visual image of moving chairs around.
Mayors don't do that. They're out in the street. They stop. People think in New York City think that the mayor's job is to kind of be Superman, a combination of Superman, the fire commissioner, the police commissioner, and
people don't want to see a mayor roll up his sleeves and get in there and look real.
That's not rolling up sleeves. The better Gifford Miller commercial probably would have been, let's see, it was the worst of times in New York City in almost 30 years. Fiscal crisis looming. Schools could be shut, firehouses closed, or police stations closed. Gifford Miller becomes Speaker of the New York City Council. He brings people together. He fights the cuts and works with the mayor to make sure that seniors are protected, that schools are protected, and our services aren't cut. He's done the job. I mean, that's kind of the argument. There is no proof positive he could be mayor in here. What there is a good idea.
Funny enough, Gifford Miller is evidence that money is not everything in politics, because he had so much more money than Virginia Fields, but she came in 3rd, he came in 4th.
That's right. He also had the major county organizations. He had Brooklyn and I think Queens as well that were behind him. He had over 100 officials who were behind him, and it all amounted to nothing. He spent $7 million. And that ad, I mean, I was asked on a different show, spontaneously, they said, which do you think are the ads that have the most impact? And I said, well, there's this thing where Gifford Miller's pushing the chairs around. I remember that. But you're right. It makes him look like he's running for chancellor, not like he's running for mayor.
Interesting. Now, here's yet another ad from the last few days. And yes, only one party had a mayoral primary yesterday, but you were as likely to see this ad on TV as any messages from Democrats.
It's called social promotion. For decades, the school system shuffled kids from grade to grade, even if they weren't ready. Mike Bloomberg took the system on. For kids, against tough opposition, he ended social promotion in the 3rd and 5th grades. Now kids falling behind get individualized instruction. Official test scores are up by record amounts. And now Bloomberg plans to end social promotion in the 7th grade. Accountability, standards, results. Determined leadership is making progress for our kids.
Hank, you want to compare the two education ads, Gifford Miller's and Mike Bloomberg?
This is much more adult and much more effective, and this is not intellectual. The other one is a very intellectual argument, you know? And the notion that somehow you snap your fingers and kids pop out from 35 to 17 is kind of silly. It's not believable. That's a believable argument. Direct to the point, clear language, text determines spots, not pictures necessarily. If you don't have good text, you don't have good narrative, the visuals aren't going to work. The visuals are very clear. He appears as a decision maker. He appears as someone who's doing something. He appears very serious, and the kids around him happen to be Latin black. Okay, there's a reason for that.
And Errol, I wonder if you think we have a classic Republican-Democratic split in these two ads. The Democrat Miller was promising you something. We're going to spend more on class size and reduce it for you. The Republican was getting tough and saying, we're going to cut down on social promotion, the bad guys.
Well, that's right. In fact, Weiner said the same thing. It's that, restore discipline. Absolutely. And it absolutely resonates. It goes to the heart rather than the head. And anybody who's a parent knows that, when you find out about how bad things are going on in the school, the thing you think of is, if I got in there and I could kick some butt and make these teachers and make these kids do the right thing the way it was done when I was a kid, we could turn this thing around. And that's what Bloomberg's counting on.
Now, we've heard Ferrer attack Bloomberg during the race, obviously, but we haven't heard Bloomberg do anything other than what he did there, which is to say, haven't I done a good job as mayor? There are various other ads that he's had on. Rudy Giuliani saying he's done a good job. Other issue ads saying, I've done a good job. Are we going to see the Bloomberg attack machine go after Freddie Ferrer right away?
I think you are. I don't know if you're going to see it in ads, but the comment you mentioned earlier today, talking about party bosses, they think that's one of their strong cards, and they're going to play that card. They're
playing Freddie Ferrer as a party boss?
Not as a party boss, but as a captive of party bosses, or as part of the old way of doing things, the old Board of Estimate, the old sort of scandal-tarred administration.
The old Bronx machine.
The old Bronx machine, which frankly he doesn't really quite emerge out of. I mean, he comes out of the worst part of the scandal and as the alternative.
There was an old. You got to be old enough to remember the old Bronx machine and its scandal.
He was no reformer. Let's be clear about that. He came right out of Stanley Friedman's head. He was the favorite son in that machine. He was their great star.
But he was not tarnished by it.
No, he became borough president because Stanley Simon, the borough president, who was Friedman's other pick, got locked up.
How else is Bloomberg going to go after Ferrer?
Well, there'll also be an efficiency issue. I mean, I think they're going to really push hard on what he really did as borough president of the Bronx. I mean, the reality is he straddled the period when the borough president sat on the Board of Estimate and actually had a vote, a significant vote on every piece of city spending over $5,000. But he also was a borough president when most of their powers were stripped away. So they're going to really sort of focus on this and say, look, did you really build 66,000 units of housing in the Bronx, or were you a bystander?
But he has a good reputation, Ferrer, as borough president. And he can say, certainly has said, and I think this is his reputation for anybody who's paid attention to it, that he presided over the beginning of the comeback of the South Bronx and other parts of the Bronx. And not only presided over it, but helped to lead it. Will he have to defend that?
I would suggest that there is, like you, who does not remember, like those who do not remember what the machine was like, there are a lot of people who have no memory of what the South Bronx was and what it is today are two entirely different places. It was quite some time ago. Remember, Fernando Ferrer of the Bronx became the borough president there in 87?
I don't know.
In the political world, that's 20 generations ago. All politics are in the present tense.
Yeah. But that makes it hard, doesn't it, for Bloomberg to run against Ferrer's record as borough president, because he ended there a relative long time ago as well.
Listen, everybody who's ever been in public life has enough stuff to run against them to last a life. They fill up a book. You just go after him.
And it's not so much Freddie himself. It's the people around him. It's it's the Roberto Ramirez's. It's the wheeler and dealers, the guys who make deals, the guys who make and break judges, the people who get contracts from the city. That's going to be sort of a weak point. And I've talked about this, several journalists have, with Ferrer. Over a year ago we talked about this with him. And he knows it's going to be an issue. It's almost like the Swift boat with Kerry. He knows it's coming. The question is going to be, has he prepared a counter response? I haven't heard one so far.
Hank, you're a Democratic Party consultant. Do you think the National Democratic Party cares enough about defeating Republican Mike Bloomberg that they're going to sink a lot of resources into this race to counter Bloomberg's millions?
They might. Look, it is a national embarrassment. A lot of things are a national embarrassment to Democrats. Mostly the Democrats are a national embarrassment to Democrats. They don't get it.
And you say that as a Democrat?
I'm disgusted. I mean, I'm really disgusted.
Why are you disgusted?
Because if you hate working people, if you make fun of people who are religious, if you think you have all the answers, and the only thing you can do is defend Roosevelt and the New Deal, then you're really in trouble.
You think that's what the Democratic Party is doing?
Please, that's why they're in trouble. That's those are some of the reasons they're in trouble. Excuse me.
Are you
presidential elections are won in 4 states in the Midwest. White, male, Catholics, 45 plus, whose fathers and grandfathers served in Vietnam or Korea, who are generally related to the UAW or Industrial Trade Union by either 1 or 2 or 3 degrees. Hey, those are the folks. They've been telling Democrats to take a hike for quite some time, and those should be the Democrats to have. There's got to be a reason for it.
Last word, Errol Lewis?
Well, I think Hank Sheinkopf is right. I mean, the local party has slightly different issues. I think there are issues of relevance, there are issues of projecting competence, and are just not strong enough at this point to counter the tens of millions of dollars, which is an underreported story. I think we in the press have given the mayor a free pass. I mean, one of the things, it's not just the composition of the ad, but the frequency of it. And the fact that, I dare say if I gave Hank Sheinkopf $20 million to promote you for mayor, you'd be a real contender in very short order.
So do you think that Mayor Bloomberg's advertising blitz over this crucial period in the Democratic primary campaign affected the outcome of the primary?
I don't know if it affected the outcome of the primary. I think that, well, you know what, it might have. There's this theory going around found that a lot of Bloomberg Democrats stayed home just because they planned to vote for him anyway. Well, if that's the case, those ads probably had something to do with it.
Errol has a point. I just had one other thing. New York politics are not very interesting at many times. They're kind of cyclical, and the same faces keep popping up, and they're very interesting trends. Like, how often is a mayor thrown out after his first term? 2 in my lifetime, Beaman Dinkins, but Bob Wagner served 3 terms, John Lindsay served 2 terms, Ed Koch served 3 terms, Rudy Giuliani served 2 terms. Doesn't happen that often.
Thanks, Sheinkopf. Errol Lewis, thanks a lot. Coming up next, we turn from the local to the global. The United Nations is holding a historic summit here in the city. This week, 175 world leaders with the ambitious goal of significantly reducing world poverty by 2015. We'll talk with guests from India and the Netherlands. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
Is I had this real rich, wonderful literary legacy, you know, in my own family. And I began to tell those stories. And in telling those stories, I think I've become much more successful. I mean, I think that Intimate Apparel is a direct outgrowth of being true to who I am and true to my own voice.
I have an insatiable curiosity, you know, and I am always very curious while I'm working on something. What about if I turn to this next? I guess I want to make sure that I've explored all that there is to explore.
When I write my plays, I hire these beautiful actors to stand in for myself, and they can voice my ardor in ways that I could never do in public.
Hope. It's more powerful than a hurricane. Help victims of Hurricane Katrina and thousands of other disasters across the country each year. Call or visit redcross.org today.
This is Brian Lehrer Live, our season premiere for fall 2005. We'll be here every Wednesday night at 7:30. Now, what most New Yorkers know about the United Nations Summit taking place here this week is that it's causing traffic headaches on Manhattan's East Side. But it is so much more than that. For one thing, the UN is debating how to fix its own ethical house. For another, we have about 175 world leaders with the ambitious goal of significantly reducing world poverty by 2015. One proposal: for every industrial country to donate 0.7% of its gross national income to development aid. We will talk now with 2 guests attending the summit from 2 different continents. Salil Shetty, Director of the United Nations Millennium Campaign, and Eveline Herfkens, Executive Coordinator of the campaign. He's from India. She's from the Netherlands. Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live. Thank you very much for coming in. For our viewers not familiar with it, just tell us what the Millennium Campaign is, basically.
We try to mobilize people to hold their governments to account for the promises they've made to indeed halve world poverty by 2015, getting all kids to school, empower women, reduce child and maternal mortality, fight AIDS, etc.
Expand on that.
Well, I think, Brian, when I've been working in India and Africa for the last 20 years, and whenever I go to a village and you ask people what are your most important pressing needs, they basically come up with food, water, health, education, and poverty. And these are essentially these most pressing priorities of the majority of the world's population are what these goals are about.
Now, Eveline, I noticed that the first thing you said was to get countries to keep their promises. Exactly. And I want to show our viewers an ad, a newspaper ad that your group had in the New York Times today, among other places, I presume. Take a look at this. It's a Pinocchio ad. And it says there's growing concern that world leaders won't keep their promise to end poverty by 2015. That's a promise that world leaders have made already?
Yes, in the year 2000 already, in the Millennium Declaration of which these goals are derived. But the real problem is, if you go to the United Nations, you hear these leaders making speeches, beautiful speeches and they sign the most beautiful declarations, but then they take back the plane home to business as usual. And we cannot, as the UN, send the police if a government doesn't live up to its promise. It's only the citizens and the parliaments, the congresses of the world that can hold their own government to account for the promises they made.
So there's been all this wrangling over the last few weeks. Perhaps some of our viewers are aware that John Bolton, the new U.S. UN ambassador, has been seen as trying to stop a lot of this, and a compromise was reached in the last day. What's in that compromise?
Well, I think one of the very important things is that developing countries, because when we talk about these goals and poverty, at the end of the day, however much external help you may get, in the case of India, for example, we have about 400 million people who go to bed hungry every day. And it's very difficult for the US or anybody else to sort this problem out. First responsibility lies with the governments of developing countries to find solutions to their own problems. So one of the things which has come out of this summit already is that developing countries have reaffirmed their commitment to improve their own internal governance, to fight corruption, to deal with, to make sure the budgets are in place, not just from external resources, but also domestic resources, because countries like India, or Brazil have significant resources, or Kenya, where I worked. If the taxes are collected, we can do a lot more. But we do need the other side.
Yes. Well, the good news today was that President Bush was standing there and saying, we support the Millennium Development Goals.
Did that surprise you?
Full stop. Well, it was a very happy moment. Full stop. No, conditioning. It was a wonderful moment. Reconfirmed the American commitments to these goals. Now, the point indeed is that the primary responsibility is with developing countries. But the poor countries among the developing countries, will simply not be able to do it by themselves. And for that, we rich countries have promised 5 years ago, but also earlier, to increase our aid, to make aid more effective, to give more debt relief, and to ensure that trade rules would be more fair to poor countries so they can trade themselves out of poverty.
So let me throw some numbers at our viewers and then ask you about a numerical compromise that either was or wasn't reached today. I'm not sure which. The Millennium Development Goals were supposed to include 0.7% of a wealthy nation's GNP for development aid. That's 0.7% of the total economy of the U.S. and other wealthy nations. We currently give less than 0.2%. So this would be tens of billions extra dollars per year out of the U.S. coffers. Now, I read one report on the wires today that said the United States brokered a compromise that does include that goal, and another one that said the U.S. got that numerical goal out. Which is it?
No, it's very much there. I mean, the document is very clear that those governments who have already committed to 0.7% will deliver on that, and for those who are not, they're going to be encouraged to do that. I mean, in the case of the US, for example, because the economy of the US is so big, it's not just a question of 0.7% or not. I think what we're saying is that the Bush administration has increased aid. The fact is the aid levels have gone up, but they can do a lot more. I mean, currently the figure's around, I think, $20 billion, $19 billion. If you compare that with the big European economies, it's less than half of what the Europeans are giving already. So they can do a lot better. That's the point we're making.
Yeah. And the issue is that all governments have to live up to what they promised. All rich countries, except for the US, have been promising the 0.7. But the United States did promise increases several times in Monterey, the State of the Union, several times. And what we would like to see from the United States is actually living up to what they have promised, which is not the 0.7, but substantial increases.
And just to be clear, for you economists in the audience, that's 0.7% of GDP, of annual gross domestic product. You come from the Netherlands. The Netherlands already donates more than 0.7% of its annual GDP.
For more than 30 years.
Now,
yes.
One of the United States' objections to this is that so much of the money is flushed down the drain because so many of the developing countries have corrupt governments. Governments where there's either a lot that winds up in the government officials' pockets, or governments that have terrible economic policies or undemocratic leadership, which actually hampers poverty relief and smart development. They have a point about that, don't they?
Well, depends on the quality of the aid you give. I was actually in the government in the Netherlands responsible for this big checkbook. And my own taxpayers had questions about that too.
So how did you make sure this money was efficiently
Well,
spent?
I think the donor community has become much more effective to talk with recipient governments. Can we see your books? Can we see your budget? Because this is not just about the way we spend our aid money. This is much more also about how do countries spend their own domestic resources, their own public expenditure. And there is much more agreement today that indeed support to governments has to be dependent on the quality of governments, the quality of the budgets of the countries concerned. And on the issue of corruption, you know, there was a taboo 10 years ago. Now it's really happening that governments in Africa and elsewhere are taking actions. Vice presidents are being fired and ministers because of that. So there's a tremendous improvement from the side of developing countries to do better. But indeed, aid to government should be focused on those that have done their homework. And then you can tell your taxpayers, thanks to your dollar or euro, millions of kids and girls go to school today. And then taxpayers are prepared to give more and more.
The ad that we saw before, was that an attempt, as I've heard the Millennium Campaign is engaging in, to go over the heads of the government officials right to the general public to try to build support for this?
The mandate of the campaign, in a sense, is to take the goals to the people, not ourselves, but through citizens' efforts, through parliamentarians, through local authorities. The people who are campaigning for these goals are growing in number. You know, we now have over 75 countries where there are national campaigns with millions of citizens already talking about the goals, and many of them are using this white band as the icon. Actually, Evelyn's got a much nicer one than I have, and that's it. Ultimately, you know, in developing countries, you are asking about corruption. I mean, we don't think that you can solve these problems from outside. The citizens of, you know, Ghana or Burundi need to hold their governments to account on corruption. I mean, however much you push from outside, things are not going to change.
This summit is a much bigger news story in almost every corner of the world than the United States. Why do you think the awareness is so poor here?
Well, I think you know, that's a lot of the countries where you have high aid levels are also the countries which have invested in creating awareness and education over a long period of time on international issues. So I think it's really, and there's a strong correlation. If you look at it analytically, there's a strong correlation. And here I think there needs to be a lot more work on awareness. I mean, for example, I'm sure Evelyn's going to refer to this. If you ask the average American citizen as to what do they think the American government gives towards aid, I mean, they think that it's 15% of the budget, whereas actually it's, you know, half of 1%, as you said. So,
yes. And are these goals really reachable? They sound so abstract and they sound so far away. When you talk about cutting the worst poverty in half by 2015, 2015 sounds far away. It sounds like something a bureaucrat can fudge. Are we going to see anything next year or the year after that if this money comes in?
Well, what I find very encouraging is that even in sub-Saharan Africa, in the poorest part of the world, there are several countries on track on some of the goals. At least 8 countries will achieve the goals, getting all kids to school. And the essence of success stories is time and time again, governments living up to their promise. These countries have good policies, prioritize their own budget.
Once again,
and rich countries were generous for this group.
Living up to their promise.
That will make it work.
Thank you very much. Good luck to you in doing some of the most important work in the world. We really appreciate it. And that's it for our season premiere of Brian Lehrer Live. Check us out every Wednesday night this fall at 7:30. Next week, we'll critique the television coverage of the first week of the general election mayoral campaign. And for more on the UN summit, tune into my radio show tomorrow morning at 10 on WNYC 93.9 FM. Have a great night.